Hello, everybody, and welcome to Monument Markers and Memory Response, challenging the state-sponsored protection of Confederate monuments, iconography, and heritage in Florida. This symposium brings together politicians, activists, artists, and other community stakeholders to focus on issues of restorative justice and memorialization. Highlighting the Gamble Plantation as a local example, we will discuss the movement to dememorialize Confederate symbols, flags, and monuments, and to repeal legislation designed to protect Confederate iconography and heritage. This series is a collaboration of effort and support from the Florida Public Archaeology Network, the University of South Florida Department of Anthropology, the University of South Florida Contemporary Art Museum, the John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art, and the New College Public Archaeology Lab. The symposium series received generous support from the Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities and from USF Research and Innovation. First, I would like to acknowledge that the land that we are on today are the traditional homelands and territories of the Seminole, as well as other historical groups, including the Calusa and Tocobaga. Today, the state of Florida is home to the Seminole, Miccosukee, Muskogee, and Choctaw, and to individuals of many other Native groups. We recognize the historical and continuing impacts of colonization on Indigenous communities, their resilience in the face of colonial and state-sponsored violence, and fully support Indigenous sovereignty. Second, I would like to acknowledge the land we are on embodies the labor and lives of the nearly 200 enslaved peoples who inhabited this plantation and its grounds over 150 years ago. And so with that, I would like to introduce Renee Gilmore, who is the moderator for today's discussion. She is the executive producer and host of ABC 7's Sarasota's Empowering Voices.
Diane, thank you so much. And it is a pleasure to be here today. So I want to just say a few words about how important this is to me, because when I was first introduced to this plantation, I was about 7 years old. And interestingly enough, my great-grandfather, I'm fourth generation of Sarasota, and my great-grandfather took myself and my brother out fishing one day on what was then called City Island. It's now called Ken Thompson Park. But we came from a fishing day, driving past the beach, and my great-grandfather, who I know was born in 1899, we started talking about fishing and just growing up, that kind of thing. And I asked my great-grandfather, were you ever a slave? Keeping in mind, I'm 7 years old at the time, and so not really having context between 1865 and 1899, it all sounded like slavery time to me. My great-grandfather used it as a teaching moment, said, nope, I was never a slave, but I can tell you about slavery. And we actually have a plantation nearby. And we left, again, what was then City Island and drove down the street so that we could come by the Gamble Plantation. And we had a conversation about slavery, but primarily it was a conversation about the pride that I should have being a young woman of color, and being able to come out of the conditions and rise to education and that kind of thing. So it was very much a teaching moment. But I can tell you that the impact it had on me coming by a plantation, having my great-grandfather say that this was actually a place who people look like us were enslaved and were working, it really put, as a little girl, fear in my heart. And so I am so pleased that we have these conversations today about the impact that our past and how it's presented to young children. And I would say to young girls in particular, because that was my point of reference. But it is something else to be sitting here. And in fact, when we drove by, my great-grandfather, I said, can we go in? Can I take a look at it? My great-grandfather said, you will never set foot on that ground. And it was from a perspective of, no way will I have my great-granddaughter prancing around looking at a plantation as though it's a good thing. It was a learning experience. So again, I'm just honored to be able to be a part of this, facilitate a discussion about living history, if you will. Now, with that, I want to introduce, please, Chandra Carty. Sandra is from Bradenton and now lives in Atlanta. She began her career with a degree in food service and human nutrition from the University of Florida. Ms. Carty completed her Master's of Medical Science at Emory University. After leaving Emory, Chandra opened her own private nutrition practice, Nutrition in the Now. Chandra is the descendant of Nelson and Mariah Burton, who were both enslaved laborers who lived and worked on the Gamble plantation. Welcome, Sandra. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. And let me make a correction. It's not food service, it's food science. So thanks. Um, I am so grateful to be here. As said, my name is Chandra Renee Bivens Carty, and I am the granddaughter, fourth removed, of Nelson and Mariah Burton. I've been tracing my family history for over 3 years. I began at the Manatee County Historical Library, where Kathy Slaffler and Kristen Miner have been very helpful in allowing in retrieving deed books and maps and other documents for me to review. Kristen contacted me about 3 years ago in 2018 and asked for my permission to share my family's information. And at the time, I said no. And the reason I said no is because my family is very concerned with how our information will be used. And so, speaking for the family and a lot of the descendants who live in Manatee County, we are very cautious with the information that we share to anybody who wants to understand the information a little bit more. Um, I recently was contacted by John Sims, who took the time to speak to me. He asked me to share my family history with him, which was a very, very different approach that I appreciated. He said to me, I have a project and I would like you to write a letter to your grandfather. That allowed me to have a conversation with my grandfather that began 3 years ago when my mother was ill. I started writing that letter and I said to John, you know, I've already started that letter. So I dug the letter out and I started rewriting the letter. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to participate in discovering what happened at this plantation. It's sort of emotional when I sit here, realizing that my family, my great great grandfather, actually lived here on this plantation for 30 years. And during that time, growing up as a kid, we called it the mansion. It was not the plantation. As a senior in high school, I was actually on the balcony of that plantation, and I took pictures. But I never did realize anybody in the family lived here. So that is, you know, something that I am actually processing as we sit here. Um, the Manatee County marriage records show that Nelson Burton and Mariah Washington Burton were married in 1872. And what's key about that is Archibald McNeil, who was one of the overseers at the plantation, was the justice of peace. So I hear several messages about slave treatments and so forth. Nelson was brought here at the age of 22 by the Gamble family from Tallahassee. Nelson lived on this plantation for 30 years, but was all of his treatment harsh? I don't know. But from the records that I read, and I'll share some of that in just a little while, there's some questions that I do have. Um, he was a slave for the Gamble family, Cofield and Davis family, and finally the McNeil family. The marriage records show that Nelson Burton and Mariah Burton were married in 1872. That's a few years, about 7 years after slavery. Archie McNeil, who was the overseer, was the justice of peace to his marriage. Nelson and Mariah were married, and also Mariah's daughter, Melissa, was married. They lived on this plantation in 1870s, and they were married by the overseer on this plantation. So I have some questions about their treatment. A letter from Robert Gamble's brother in law, Mr. McFarland, said he feared the old residents who considered the land exhausted because by this time, you remember the Confederate Army used this plantation to hide arms and store food, but then the Union Army came and destroyed everything. So Captain McNeil, who was the overseer, was managing the plantation, but his letter says he could not make sweet potatoes grow. And he says anybody can grow sweet potatoes, but Archie McNeil cannot grow sweet potatoes. It is very unusual thing for an agent to disparage the property of his principal, and it is equally unusual for a faithful agent to allow the property of his principal to be plundered and destroyed, as it seems to be the case in his instance. I must confess that I have but little confidence in Captain McNeil, and that when I first read your letter, my indignation was fully aroused at what I believe to be his base misrepresentation and faithless conduct. So that tells me Captain Archie McNeil in, viewed the slavery management a little differently than some of the other owners of this property. The Confederate government commandeered the plantation in the spring of 1862. Captain McNeil was the overseer and lived with his family until 1863. The sugar mill was destroyed in 1864. And so there's this period of time that I wonder what happened to this land after it was destroyed by the Union Army. What happened to those slaves? When I read, I laugh. I say, people extrapolate conditions and they apply that to a certain situation. I don't want that to happen in this area. I don't want you to read what happened at another plantation and say that happened here, because my records will question that. And I say, okay, well, let's see what happened. You had 165 slaves, but at the end of that time, only 11 slaves were left. What happened to the other slaves? I don't know, but I do know what happened to one of those 11. And he was not as mistreated by our family records as it indicated. So I'm only saying that, yes, I want the story to be told, but I want accuracy in the story that is told. Take the time to read the documents and do not extrapolate from somebody else's document about this area. That's what the individuals of Manatee County do not want to happen. And I am their representation, and I will make sure that whatever story is told is accurate. Lastly, what type of character did Nelson Burton have? And I found in the deed where Nelson and Mariah got into an argument. They had to pay the Justice of Peace $50. It says, we, Nelson Burton and Mariah Burton, his wife, are firmly bound unto the governor of state of Florida in the sum of $50. We shall keep peace towards the people of the state of Florida. So that tells me that, yeah, there were disagreements amongst the slaves themselves, the people themselves, but were they put in prison? Nelson wasn't. Was he accountable? Yes, he had to pay a fine. Who did he pay a fine to? Archibald McNeil, his overseer. So that McNeil family and my family, there's a relationship. I don't understand what, but that family did sell our family a lot of property. And Nelson was hand selected to take care of my grandmother and her daughter. So every overseer is not the same character. About the Gambles, I don't know, but the historical account says they did allow some of the slaves to eat, have days off. So I am having to dig into a lot of letters just to see, who was beaten, who wasn't beaten. Of course, all of that to that detail is not told, but there are some good things. And I say, Nelson, he learned a trade. He did his trade well. Nelson took care of his family. He took care of his family well. I am one of the descendants of that family. And yes, I I walked this ground. I was a senior in the top 10% at this ground. So I will encourage others to come to this ground and see what happened. And you can go away saying that, yes, you are a proud people. That's what my mother taught me. Hold your head high and be proud of who you are and what you have accomplished and how far you have come. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandra. Such a compelling legacy. I'd like to introduce now Antoinette Jackson. Antoinette Jackson is professor and chair in the Department of Anthropology at the University of South Florida, and she is the director of the USF Heritage Research Lab. She earned a PhD in anthropology from the University of Florida, an MBA from Xavier University, and a BA in computer and information science from Ohio State University. Dr. Jackson completed a 4-year federal appointment as the regional cultural anthropologist and ethnogen, ethnogeologist program manager for the U.S. National Park Service in 2016. She was recently awarded a USF funded research grant focused on understanding and addressing Blackness and anti-Black racism for her project entitled African American Burial Grounds and Remembering Project, Living Communities Challenging Silenced Histories in Florida. The project focused on activities to identify, interpret, preserve, and record unmarked, previously erased, and underserved African American burial grounds. Dr. Jackson is editor-in-chief of the journal Present Past, and her work on heritage has been published widely. Her book, Speaking for the Enslaved, Heritage Interpretation at Antebellum Plantation Sites, was published in 2012. And her new book, Heritage, Tourism, and Race, The Other Side of Leisure, was published in 2020. Welcome, Ms. Jackson.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that great introduction. Now I only have about 2 minutes on my part.
No, we want to hear. Please talk to
it
us
is a
about
pleasure.
why is it important?
Yeah, no, it is a pleasure to be here and support my colleague, Dr. Wallman, and to be on the panel with all of you. And the stories that I've been hearing Chandra and yourself tell are the reasons actually that I'm here today at this plantation site, because if anyone had told me, and I will tell you a little bit more about my past journey in a bit, but if anybody had told me I'd be on a plantation, on a panel talking about people's experiences and their lives on the plantation communities, I would have laughed, because I totally avoided that kind of engagement with plantations, particularly because of what you two have shared, because the shame, the negative connotations, the lumping together of stories in an aggregate about experiences and people and the people who were enslaved on those plantation spaces. So it wasn't until I was able to hear specific stories, work with specific people and communities, and interview and talk to individuals, that my whole understanding of the plantation as a living community and the trials and tribulations and the accomplishments and the things that people overcome became more readily available to me. But I'm here today at Gamble because of the deafening silences, really, surrounding the life, labor, love, joy, pain, and sheer humanity, as you all have brought out today, of the hundreds of people who were enslaved here. Hundreds of enslaved Africans and their descendants labored here. What is their story? And as Chandra said, we need to find out what are those particular stories, particular to particular plantation spaces. We need markers, we need representation of those stories. I'm here at Gamble because, like my colleagues on this panel and people everywhere are saying, we are demanding now is the time for public recognition and bold actions. Now is the time to ask, to petition without ceasing for something more, to tell a bigger story. I stand with John and Chandra and Renee and the descendants of this plantation and share their vision and hopes of how to honor those who lived here and worked here. Again, we need markers to those who are enslaved. Now's the time and place to place these plantation spaces and these stories in critical dialogue, to tell a bigger story, to tell a complex story of the institution of slavery. Again, we hear that those stories, even in this small discussion, the complexity in those stories. Um, to talk about centering the lives of people marginalized and enslaved within the system for profit and comfort for those they served. Regardless of how nice or how helpful or how faithful, the system of slavery meant those enslaved had no legal rights to anything. Some people fought to bend the system, others survived as best they could, paving the way for us, people on the panel here, to stand at this plantation and talk to you and to share our experience and experiences that shaped us and to be real about that experience for each of us. Now, for me, I started my journey into anthropology in avoidance of plantation spaces, and it was only on a trip that I was telling Renee, my previous job was a product manager for AT&T Lucent Technology, and I just took a trip along the Sea Islands, which is on the coast of South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida, and Georgia. And I was driving and I stopped in St. Helena Island in South Carolina, because I was curious actually about the history of that area. And what I took away from there encouraged me to find out more. I found out that I didn't even know half the history about enslaved Africans in that area of the country, descendants of Africans who worked on rice plantations, whose labor was used to make that industry one of the number one industries in the US. So it was that um, actual experience and hearing those stories from real people that it changed my mind about the shame and the avoidance I had for plantation spaces. And fast forward, I decided to get a degree in anthropology because in the end of the day, I wanted to be part of telling that story because I found that so many people didn't understand the perspective that's been shared even today about many of these plantation spaces. And because I entered into it through conversations with people about their everyday lives, through recipes, through songs, through their engagement with those plantation spaces as young children or grandchildren or great grands of people who lived and worked on those spaces. But they entered into those stories in a different way. And it taught me that in order to share that message with others, I had to enter into those spaces individually. Not one story can tell it all, and learn the story of those spaces from each of the people or the communities that I'm working in. I remember leaving, I was working in South Carolina in Mount Pleasant, and one of the signature, those rice plantations, and they are known for basket making, basket weaving, and those kinds of things. And also that story of sharecropping. One of the things they told me as a researcher when I left that plantation space is tell them we were never sharecroppers. Their story wasn't the sharecropper. They didn't leave enslavement, move to sharecropping, then maybe get some land. Their story was more that they inherited land and was able to build communities from there.
So, Dr. Jackson, I think you were talking about the fact that there were people who said, make sure that the audience knows or your public knows that they were not sharecroppers. They actually inherited, they actually owned land.
Yes. And that the mantra that people said, tell them we were never sharecroppers, kind of speaks to what Chandra was saying. Don't lump us into one story about a plantation narrative. Let our story speak for itself. And so one of the things they did, they were able to buy land and own land. And a lot of times people thought post-slavery that because they worked on these plantations, like Sneap Farm Plantation or Boone Hill Plantation, that they were sharecroppers, but really they were day laborers. They worked there during the day and maybe stayed, even some people, the stories I heard of some of the people, they stayed in the plantation enslaved African cabins during the weekday, and then on the weekends they went home to the houses and properties that they owned and built in their communities. So that was one story I've heard. There are a range of plantation experiences and stories, and so the point is we cannot lump all the stories together, and that's what one of the lessons learned about how do you study plantation spaces. Again, we need to talk to people individually. We need to understand their specific story. People always ask us, again, as Chandra pointed out, that what are you going to tell about my story? How is it going to be conveyed? plantation descendants and descendants of enslaved Africans and plantation descendants of plantation owners tell me the same thing when I interview them or talk to them. How am I going to be represented? How is my story going to be told? And that's, that's a important question. Again, we need to put the stories in context. Although the stories are individual stories, we can place them in context. And so the point is that intangible cultural heritage, the stories people tell, the communities they built, are lessons in and of themselves. And one of the takeaways for what we're doing here and what Dr. Wallman is pursuing is, how do we tell these kinds of stories? How do we both mark with physical markers, monuments, and those types of things? And how do we mark with intangible cultural heritage? How do we collect the stories? How do we tell the stories of people who are connected to these plantation spaces in a way that resonates with them, in a way that's real? And so there are a diversity of stories, and we want to collect as many of those as possible. So as I'm involved in this project, that is the direction that I bring to the study of plantation places and the lessons that I've learned in all the research I've done with plantation spaces. One couple models that I want to quickly share before I end. In 1988, the Charles Pinckney National Historic Site right there in South Carolina, where one of the projects I worked on, was established to tell the story of Charles Pinckney. It was supposed to be built to interpret that story. And so he was a drafter of the US Constitution. He was a two-time term governor of South Carolina and a defender of slavery. But in 1990, the National Park Service decided and proposed and required that plantation space be used to tell the story of all the site's inhabitants. It was decreed that it tell all of the stories, or the stories of all of the people. So that's one thing we're talking about here. And the second thing is the Gullah Geechee. In 2006, the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor was established as a national heritage area by President Bush. It was designated as such. It was the first such corridor in the country designated to discussing and focusing on the history of African people, descendants of African people, particularly descendants of Africans who worked on those rice plantations. So it is a big deal, this Gullah Geechee National Heritage Area and Corridor. And it's another model. How do we focus on the history and heritages of these people in those spaces? And then finally, I want to leave us with the way forward and evoke Amanda Gorman again and say that has given me new life in terms of what we can do in these kinds of spaces and why we are doing these kinds of things. She says in one piece of her poem on January 20th, it's because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. And so we are stepping into the repair. How do we enlarge this story and be critical and put it in all its complexity? People shy away from that, but I think this is our charter today, and the work that we're all doing up here speaks to that. So again, this is right now an intangible heritage moment and we are celebrating and invoking the people that lived here and honoring them. And I look forward to the continued efforts of everybody and working with everybody on this panel. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. I'd like to now introduce John Sims. He is a Detroit native and Sarasota-based multimedia artist, writer, activist, and he creates art and curates projects spanning the areas of installation, performance, text, music, film, and large-scale activism, informed by mathematics, design, the politics of white supremacy, sacred symbols, anniversaries, and poetic political text. Currently, John is an artist in residence at the Ringling Museum, where he developed the performance piece 2020 Divisions of America. For 20 years, he's been working on the forefront of contemporary mathematical art and leading the national pushback on Confederate iconography. Over the last 20 years, John Sims has been working on the national art activism project called Recoloration Proclamation, which explores, re-examines, and remixes Confederate iconography as it relates to the African American experience. The project features recolored Confederate flags, a hanging installation in Gettysburg, a 13 Southern states Confederate flag funeral. He's produced videos, site-specific performances, a play, a collection of experimental films, the music project, Afro-Dixie Remixes, the annual Burn and Bury Confederate Flag Memorial, and most recently, the outside performance and Kennedy Museum exhibit of the proper way to hang a Confederate flag at Ohio University. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CNN, NBC News, USA Today, NPR, The Guardian, Think Progress, Al Jazeera, Art in America, Sculpture, Science News, Nature, and Scientific American. He has written for CNN, Al Jazeera, the Tampa Bay Times, the Huffington Post, the Rumpus, and the Griot. And he's been on Empowering Voices.
Thank you, Renee. I want to thank Diane. I want to thank everybody for being here in this very incredible and historic moment where we can have these conversations that I hope that can lead to action. So I want to speak to my relationship to this space because I think that's what the question calls for. So 2020 was a very incredible year. We got the pandemic, we got police brutality, we have George Floyd, we have, and then the George Floyd dynamic created this national, international kind of Black Lives Matters moment, where we start looking at iconography of white supremacy, not just in the United States, but all over the world, in Europe and other places. And so during that time, because I've been very active as your introduction, dealing with Confederate flag stuff, dealing with kind of interrogating and repositioning Confederate iconography. So when there was this national kind of confrontation with Confederate memorials, I started thinking about, well, what's going on in Florida? What's happening right here in our own community? And I remember, I'm based in Sarasota, I remember walking down Route 41 and seeing a marker that told a story about a man. I didn't remember the name. All I remember was Brains of the Confederacy, right? And I thought that was quite curious. And so I lived 3 blocks from where this marker would be, having no idea that it would still be there. And this was kind of early 2000s. I remember seeing this thing. So I took a walk, got my morning coffee at the gas station, went across the street, and there it was. Still, it was this kind of memorial to Judah P. Benjamin, the Secretary of State of the Confederacy, and apparently he had fled from Sarasota near that very spot, and there was an obelisk there and some benches, and I know there was a construction site. I'm like, oh, goody, we have something here to write about. So I went back to my studio and I started to prepare another op-ed piece, because at this point I realized writing op-eds and engage the moment in a different way than just doing art galleries and things, wine cheeks, like, get people talking. So start writing, and I, thinking about this, and I looked at the photos I took. I said, let me go back a couple days later and take some more photos, because I want to pitch this to the Herald, and I had pitched something and nothing came back. So I went down and it was gone. The marker was gone. And so I'm thinking, whoa, okay, so this is the time when people are getting afraid. Now, that big Confederate flag they have on I-4 and I-75, like they took that down because they were afraid that somebody was going to take it down. So I became very curious about why this marker all of a sudden was gone. So it turned out our city manager expedited the process of taking it down and taking some real executive control about that. And I really appreciate that she did. But nevertheless, I thought I still need to write an op-ed. So I ended up writing a piece for the Tampa Bay Times that brought attention to the Judah P. Benjamin story, and also to have all of Florida think about what's going on here in the state of Florida in terms of its relationship to Confederate iconography and the support of that. And so that happened, and wrote that piece, and I was able to get a response from Diane, who reached back out to me. But in that process, I realized there was a bigger thing going on. It wasn't just that marker. There was a whole plantation, the Gamble plantation, that it was also a memorial to Judah P. Benjamin, which I thought was also very curious. And more than that, I realized that it was a Confederate memorial and a state park. So now my money is going to support a Confederate state park in my neighborhood, so to speak. So that inspired a second op-ed piece addressing the issue of the Gamble Plantation as a state park, and also introduce a petition that would challenge it to repeal the name of the plantation, and also to recontextualize it as a place that can tell the stories of all the folks who intersected this space. And so I came here to prepare for that second op-ed, and this was the first time I've ever set foot on a plantation, and which is amazing to me because all of my work around recoloring the Confederate flag, hanging it and burning it, and remixing Dixie, all of that 20 years of this Detroiter brought me to the big house, right? The metaphor of the big house. And it was a very strange feeling, and I'm going to reflect more on that in my keynote. And so that's the second op-ed. And then coming here, it really got me to think about what's missing, what's here that shouldn't be here, why the markers, the only one marker here is so sparse in terms of the language explaining the stories of people that are connected to my experience, right? Why is there, like markers for World War II veterans, but not other veterans, and then why is that we have this big office headquarters for the United Daughters of the Confederacy? What about the descendants of the African slaves and enslaved folks? Where's their office? Where's their building? And so that inspired me to reimagine the Gamble Plantation as the Freedom Memorial, as a place that would memorialize the folks that built the building, dug for the canals. And that is a bigger metaphor and symbol for many spaces like this all over the American South. So the third piece ended up inspiring the reimagination of the Gamble Plantation, but in general, the reimagination of plantations in general. And that sort of became a very important piece of a performance I was doing as artist in resident at the Ringling Museum. And part of that 2020 Divisions of America, I wanted to reach out to Sandra, who did an incredible, absolutely brilliant, sincere, from her heart, from her position. There's lots of stories, but the only one that mattered in that moment was her story, right? And being up on stage and expressing that. And so other stories need to be told. And if we're gonna continue, if we want to move beyond a space of segregation along segregation of stories, of spaces, of spirit, then we have to move back and have a place where we can tell real stories. And those stories are protected and memorialized, like all of the dominant stories that are before us, like Robert E. Lee and so forth and all that. And so, I think we're in a particular historical moment where we're challenging the environment across the country, across the world. And I want to pay attention to the fact that It wasn't because a group of people came together over cappuccino and said, hey, let's have a discussion about Confederate iconography. No, it was about 9 people being killed and massacred in South Carolina, right, in Charleston, or George Floyd being snuffed out the way he was. Unfortunately, it takes critical death to create these kind of conversations that we're having at this moment. And I wish that we can move beyond that and get a certain level of human consciousness, that it wouldn't take death and critical loss to get us to move in these kind of discussions, particularly in a complicated society that we continue to live in. So in terms of the bigger question is how we move spaces like this and confront the kind of support that support these spaces, right? I've been talking to State Rep Tommy Gregory about the petition and some of the issues around the Gamble plantations I have, but also some of the bigger issues in the Florida context. So you can't talk without talking about the political context of Florida governance and Florida history. Like, so there's on the books right now, if you might not know, there's a Florida statute that says it's prohibitive to desecrate a Confederate flag. And this was passed in 1961. And so we're working to get that struck from the books, as well as to confront some of the Confederate holidays that we also have on the book. So this is part of a bigger project, but inside of that project is this idea, how do we embrace, confront, walk through these spaces that we're in at this very moment? And I think this is a very, very important project. And all right, so let me just I want to thank everybody, and I'm anxious to hear what Tom has to say.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, John.
Yes.
So when John mentioned that he was walking down one day and realized that poof, the bust was gone, I want to introduce the person who had everything to do with that magic moment, Tom Barwin. Tom Barwin is the City of Sarasota's city manager emeritus. For those who may not know, the city manager is the CEO of the city and is appointed by the city commission. The city of Sarasota operates a $250 million budget annually and has approximately 700 employees. The city also benefits from hundreds of volunteers who serve the community. Mr. Barwin began what he calls a sabbatical on January 1st, 2021, after serving as Sarasota's city manager for over 8 years. During Tom's tenure, he introduced partnership policing into the community. He changed homelessness strategies, which resulted in the reduction of chronic homelessness by over 50%. He advocated for the extension of Legacy Trail into downtown Sarasota, and he advocated for a mental health district within Sarasota County. Tom also helped secure funding for the restoration of Lido Beach and launched several environmental initiatives to help remove carbon from the air and reduce the threat of red tide in Sarasota Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. Before leaving his position as city manager, Tom moved the entire economic development staff of the city into the Newtown community, which is Sarasota's historically segregated community. Also, he budgeted funds for journalist Vicki Oldham's documenting the oral histories of Newtown residents while also identifying historically significant properties for rehabilitation. Tom supported former Commissioner Willie Charles Shaw's efforts for the restoration of the long neglected African American cemeteries in North Sarasota. Prior to leaving office, Tom supported public funding of art citywide, not just in downtown Sarasota. He secured property to locate the future African American Culture Center that will be located on MLK and Orange Avenue in Sarasota's Newtown community. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Renee. And as you know, and John alluded to, the city of Sarasota had a day of reckoning with our Judah Benjamin monument. And that, as I recall, to the best of my ability, began on Tuesday, June 16th in the afternoon. And as John has pointed out, so eloquently, 2020 was a heck of a year. We were dealing with probably the most divisive year in our country's history in my adult life since the 60s. Uh, every day was an argument about the pandemic and COVID, and we were amidst 20 protests within the city for racial equity following the George Floyd tragedy in Minneapolis. And my administrative assistant came in, Kathy King, and said, we have a call from a resident or a citizen who appears to be a little irritated, wants to talk to you about the Confederate monument in our town, and is pretty upset because he's called City Hall 5 or 6 times and nobody's talked to him and returned the call. So the Confederate monument sort of jumped out in my listening, and I said, okay, well, I want to hear what he's got to say, and she put him through. And fortunately, I had some time that afternoon. And it was a gentleman, I believe he said he's from Maryland, who has been coming to visit our city every year, once or twice a year for the last 20 years, to visit his parents who have resided here. And he said, I was in town last week, and once again, I jogged by that statue, and it does not, in my opinion, reflect the values of the city of Sarasota that I have come to know and understand. Sarasota being an arts community, a very diverse community. And I thanked him for his call, assured him that I would look into the matter. And I suspect he thought that was the end of what would happen. But true to my word, I went out on my way home from work that evening. And once I saw the statue or the monument, it sort of jogged my memory. I had seen it before, but it just didn't register. And I think in the Caucasian community, a lot of this stuff just doesn't register. But I became kind of obsessed with it for the next couple of days. And I went home and read up and searched the internet, and really it led to a revisiting slavery and the history of slavery. And I was very disturbed, especially by what you saw, John, the brains, it said somewhere on that thing, the brains of the Confederacy. It just left me shaking my head. And I agreed with the guy from Maryland that it didn't reflect the values of our community that I knew, and certainly where I was trying to move the community toward. Having been in city management for 40 years and have been a police officer on the street for a couple of years in Metro Detroit, I had my share of firsthand experiences trying to solve challenges. And these challenges that race, our original sin, brought to this country have been monumental, to say the least, and I'm not telling anyone here anything. They've been very tough. So because we're in an emergency, as city manager, I have some extraordinary powers to make a lot of decisions. And after viewing this thing myself, reading up on the internet, what Mr. Benjamin's role was, he was like the leading criminal in one of the biggest atrocities and genocides that has ever happened on the face of the earth. So I had pretty much made up my mind what we were going to do, but I had to do a couple things just to finish my research. So I went in, called the next day, called our staff member who's in charge of our history department. And he also had been the guy for years who had monitored our public art. And I asked him, could we move this? Is there a problem? Is it a piece of our public art collection? He said no. I said, well, who owns it? He says the Daughters of the Confederacy donated in, was it 69 or something? Not 41, not that long ago. And he says, but we haven't been able to get in touch with them for the last several years. So that made it easy for me. And I called our public works director and said, I want that out of there by Friday. And just coincidentally, Friday was Juneteenth, the 19th. I thought, what a sweet, sweet coincidence this is, that we can take some small gesture to just improve the sort of, I think, fabric of our community. Because when I went back out there that second day, I thought, what would this mean to me if I were an African American? You know, this guy was the brains who kept so many of my people in slavery and chains and did not have freedom, not to mention the economic implications of everything that's happened. I said, this has to go.
Yeah.
But I do work in a political context. We work in a highly visible setting. Hardly ever anything ever happens in Sarasota that somebody doesn't notice. Witness you, John. But I decided to low-key it, no announcements, just get it out of there and see what would happen. But I did cover my bases a little bit. Our mayor, Jenny Hernkoch at the time, also shares executive management responsibilities with the city manager. And I told her, I think on Thursday afternoon late, that I had made a decision that it had to be moved and we were going to put it in storage in the public works yard. And then I called the district representative, Liz Alpert, and told her the same. Both were completely supportive. So it was moved on the morning of Juneteenth, 2020. And later that day after it was moved, I called my good friend, District 1 Commissioner Willie Shaw, and said, Mr. Shaw, I hope you don't mind that we move that Confederate monument. And Willie, he loves to laugh. He had one of the biggest barrel laughs I've ever heard. And then he said, thank you. And I knew then that we absolutely did the right thing. And, we got a few calls. There was a little pushback, but I was amazed. For the next 2 weeks, I was wondering when somebody was going to point it out. And Carrie Seidman, a columnist from the Sarasota Herald Tribune,
Because after I called,
did a story,
Yeah.
and did a couple stories on it.
Yeah.
And I ended up briefing all the commissioners, and the community read about it twice. We got maybe about a half a dozen phone calls from people who thought it was a mistake. And I challenged them to come up with a plan to put it somewhere in the context to balance this conversation, because this isn't something we should honor. And the callers pretty much agreed, but I haven't heard from them since. So that's the story, Brittany.
Right. Wow.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'd like to introduce now Diane Wallman. She is the Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of South Florida and Director of the USF Historical Archaeology Laboratory. She has a PhD from the University of South Carolina, a master's from Washington State University, and a bachelor's from Skidmore College. Dr. Wallman is a historical archaeologist focusing on the history of European colonism and Atlantic slavery. She is the co-editor of the book Archaeology in Dominica, Everyday Ecologies and Economies at Mort Partate, out of the University Press of Florida. Dr. Wallman is a National Geographic explorer for an archaeological project on the Caribbean island of Dominica. She has also received multiple grants and awards for her archaeological and community-based research with publications across diverse venues. Thank you so much, Diane. Please speak with us about why this day is important, why being here on this plantation is important, Dr. Wallman.
Thank you so much, Renee. And at first, I want to thank everybody for coming today and participating in this very important and urgent, as I see it, event and kind of call to action. I come here from kind of various positionalities. I'm a Northerner, so I'm from New York, not from the South. I'm a white Northerner. I am an anthropologist and a historical archaeologist. I can say, my moving down south, in your 20s as a Northerner can be a bit shocking in some levels. When I first moved to South Carolina, I was taken aback quite often by the iconography, by the symbology that was presented in that state, and in particular at the State House at the time where the Confederate flag was flying before the events that John talked about a minute ago and before they decided to remove that flag from the state grounds. And so I guess for me, I sort of internalized that and was shocked at the differences in the narratives that I heard in the South versus growing up in the North, and educated as a Northerner, surrounding enslavement and other issues. And so a part of what I've been trying to do in my research as an anthropologist and as a historical archaeologist is to try to bring a broader perspective, as many have talked about today, to try and ensure that all stories are told and that those stories are told accurately and based on, factual evidence and data, and on the stories of descendants like Chandra, and on their perspectives as well. And so as a historical archaeologist in particular, I use the material records, so what people have left behind, to try to understand the past, in some with a particular data set. So this is just one of many ways that we can look to reconstruct histories and stories that have been historically silenced or historically erased or misrepresented in some way. And so that's how I'm coming from this. And when I first came down to USF, I was looking for various local projects. I've worked on plantation sites in the Carolinas, throughout the Southeast, and all throughout the Caribbean. And so I was looking for maybe some comparative research to do in a local area and bring some students out, teach them archaeology, and also highlight the many histories of plantations like Gamble. And so I identified this. I read a wonderful thesis that came out of USF from Felicia Silva, and I realized that in the story of this plantation, there was very little focus on the enslaved peoples. And then I realized that even more so, that the stories celebrated here, the main story celebrated here, was of Judah P. Benjamin. In fact, the whole plantation is a memorial to this individual as he was escaping, the Union troops to eventually end up in England. And I was shocked by that. And I feel that with my privilege and with my skill set as an archaeologist, I can try and challenge and counter some of these narratives that have been created, sometimes sort of in a revisionist way, and try and, I guess, change or add to the stories that we celebrate and that we privilege in our society. And so that's what I've been trying to do in my research here. I spent 2 seasons doing archaeology at Gamble Plantation, open to the community, trying to engage in these conversations with people. What stories are told here, and what do we need to add, right? And so that's where, when I saw John's op-ed, we reached out to each other and connected, around this particular place, because it is such an important space. Spaces like these need to be remembered, but need to be told, the stories need to be told accurately and in full. And here, the story is of the 190, plus minus 200 enslaved peoples who cleared this land, who worked it, who lived and labored here and died on this plantation, who gave birth on this plantation, got married on this plantation, right? And these are the stories that I think we need to highlight, privilege, and celebrate, these lives. And so that's where I'm coming from. And that's what I hope to do going forward with everybody on this panel today and everybody out there listening and watching, and think about, again, what types of narratives we memorialize and we create monuments for. And it matters. It matters to people, African Americans who don't come to these spaces, right, for those reasons. And it matters as Americans. It's part of our history and heritage. And that's where I come from. So I think I'll keep it short and thank everybody again for coming, both virtually and to the panel here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Waldman. I want to start with asking a question of John Sims here. So the Confederate and other Confederate flag and Confederate iconography has certainly risen to a national conversation, so much so that even on January 6th, when we saw the events at our national capital, the Confederate flag was being flown and carried throughout the entire event. John, let me start with you by asking, why at this particular time do you think there is a national conversation around Confederate iconography?
Um, well, I'm gonna give you my very honest opinion on that. I obviously we're in this Black Lives Matter movement where we're thinking about things that that speaks to white supremacy. But I also think there's a deeper reason. So you remember in 2015 when we had the Charleston murders, right? No one was really, before that, was really talking about Confederate iconography and Confederate flags. It was still kind of a low simmer thing. And then we had Dylan who shot these incredible folks in their, church. And then there was this pictures of him with the Confederate flag, right? He had a Confederate license plate or something like that. I think the reason why it became an issue around the Confederate flag is because folks didn't really want to talk about gun control. You see what I'm saying? So the Confederate thing became the consolation prize because the harder the conversation is about gun control and getting guns off the streets, right? Now, speed up to 2020. George Floyd, it's easier to talk about Confederate iconography and taking down Confederate memorials than talking about serious systemic police reform. And so I think that is the context by which we're having this really heightened discussion around Confederate iconography. This discussion should have been having for 150 years, right? All the way since 1865. But why is it so heightened now? And someone who's been working in this area for 20 years, I see how the media, how things move in ways to create a certain level of deflection from other issues that are very difficult and very scary. So you're going to get police defunding over here versus this over here. So I think those are some very interesting dynamics. On top of that, I think one of the reasons why we're talking about Confederate iconography and pushing, I think folks are ready also to have this discussion, about, because it's layered. 2015, thing that happened in Charleston, 2020, the movement is staggered. It just doesn't happen all at once, right? It's layered. And I think it becoming, and people are more apt to write about legislators are more interested now in thinking about it. And whereas when I first did this in Gettysburg in 2004, where I lynched the Confederate flag in Gettysburg, very little press, right? So I think the atmosphere, I think COVID plays a little bit into it. I think the protest movement plays into it. But underneath that, I think it's also a consolation prize to some of these deeper issues that I think folks in power are really, really worried about.
Thank you.
That's my thinking.
I'm going to go now to Mr. Barwin, City of Sarasota City Manager Emeritus. So you have been close to people, I'm going to say regular people on the street as a city manager. You're a person who people in Sarasota would call to say, hey, my garbage hasn't been picked up today. What happened to that bust of Benjamin, Mr. Benjamin out there, right? So you talk to people every day. When we talk now about the Confederate flag and why
Ready?
Brought to you by
All right, we're back up.
the
Did the
Sonic.
question get completed?
No, go ahead and start again. That would be great.
The next question we have is for City Manager Emeritus, City of Sarasota Manager Emeritus. Mr. Barwin, the Confederate flag, entire national discussion around it. You talk to people on the street all the time as a city manager. They call you for things like, where's my garbage pickup? Where's that bust of Mr. Benjamin gone to? But you talk to people all the time, the man on the street, woman on the street. Are cities like the city of Sarasota ready to have a discussion around the Confederate flag, Confederate iconography?
Well, I think, Renee, there needs to be a discussion that's related to the Confederate flag and iconography, and that's about Black poverty. And I'm hoping this will lead to that conversation. Because like John, I'm from Detroit. I have seen what racism does to a community. Detroit is a huge pocket of poverty because of racism, actually, and public policies that supported urban sprawl. And I mean, we really have to grow up now. We've learned a lot. People are, on the one hand, they're tired of friction and arguing, and everybody's bad because of some reason. But I think there's a co-balancing hunger to get to real problem solving. And I think the opportunity now is to begin with the Black Lives Matter movement has opened up an opportunity. And on top of what John said about all the reasons that have led to this being a relevant and widespread conversation now, we've had the video in the digital age. And, Renee, you and I were talking about the pros and cons of media earlier. But the pro of the situation now is people are free to learn on their own and surf on their own and dig on their own. And they get exposed to the works of someone like John Sims when he's had trouble getting his stuff exposed for a few years. If you did this way back in 2004. When I saw his hanging of the Confederate flag, my breath was taken. I thought if we could put it in somewhere like here, make the whole conversation different and get people to understand what's happened and why we have some of these challenges we have, we could actually begin solving our problems. So I think we have to be ready, Renee. And I think most people who are in the area of public policy setting and decision making need to be. And if they're not, maybe they should let their careers sunset or not run for re-election, because this is probably one of America's biggest challenges. And if we're going to ever get to that place that Dr. King talked about, that's written in our Constitution, this fundamental American problem has to be addressed.
Thank you, Mr. Barwin, for answering that question. I want to ask now, Ms. Cardy, this is a question for you, and I'd like to ask you about this plantation itself. Knowing what you know today, having done research, reading the documents that you've come across related to your family's experience, how would you rewrite how we see the Gamble plantation today? If you had the opportunity, the legislature said, Ms. Cardy, you're in charge here. What would you like to say about the plantation? How do we rewrite the script on it? What would that be?
First, I would challenge the University of South Florida and the University of Florida to go back, because both of the University of South Florida's got computer graphic images of where certain areas are. And that information was collected in the 1970s. So the information as far as certain locations, hypothetical locations, are there. However, nothing's been done. So I would challenge them to maybe work with the architectural department of the University of Florida and create a scaled model based on what they have. And what I see are, like some other museums, you see scaled models that show you the houses. They've got the information, but nothing's done with that. So I don't understand why somebody can't just produce a model that shows you not only the plantation, but all the houses, and perhaps somewhere over in the back area, put some of the cabins. It was 57 cabins. And so I've seen where other plantations have the actual drawings. We can do that here. And then you can impose some of the slaves in those drawings because Mr. Gamble has a very vivid description of his houses. And so I see that perhaps here instead of a box, a window with names of slaves. That is totally unacceptable when you've got documentation of this area, and perhaps get permission from where you suspect the locations of some of the slave cabins to be. There's a way to do it. But because no one's challenged the park or the Daughters of the Confederacy to do anything, nothing's been done. I think now is the time to go to the next level because you've got students that have worked on that project and nothing's been done. So they've laid the groundwork. Now, if you really, really, really want to have something done, you've got the information now. Let's see where it's going to go with that.
Thank you. I want to ask you a follow up to that. Because you have been at the plantation as a teenager, you were there. You stood on the balcony you talked about. And at that time, it was indeed, and it still is often referred to as the mansion. You have to be very deliberate to know, as my great grandfather did, that it was this location where we are today was a plantation. Knowing what you know now in terms of this being a plantation, yet being called the mansion, your thoughts, if you would talk to us a little bit about how you would reconcile those two in terms of words being important.
I guess I was brought up in a family that's extremely proud. I grew up during segregation where there was white fountains, colored fountains, white bathrooms, colored bathrooms. So my experience is totally different. It's not one of shame. It's not one of anger. So I don't view this space that way. I see where I was brought up where our family was given opportunities because I don't know why. And so in our family, there's nothing that you can't do. Maybe we were protected from some of the things, but my grandfather, during the time when African Americans weren't given loans, my grandfather built houses. So I come from a different perspective, and in my mind, you can accomplish whatever you choose to accomplish. If you want to change the name of the plantation, there's a way to do it. Whether it's going to be political or whatever, there's a way to do it. So your question as far as a mansion or a plantation, yeah, I thought of it as a mansion, but if it were a plantation, I don't, how can we paint the picture so that I hate the victim mentality? I've never, I'm not accustomed to that. So if there's a way to describe it where you empower the people to go forward, then that's what I think needs to be done, not from a victim. Oh yeah, we were enslaved and this was what happened to us. I don't view life that way. My family doesn't view life that way. And I wouldn't want a message communicated to the descendants of this plantation in that way. How to do it, I don't know, but it shouldn't be from a victim mentality.
Thank you for that response. All right. John?
Yeah, so that's why I called my reimagination of this space Freedom Memorial, right? Because the idea is to speak um, to the legacy of freedom and how that relates to what America is supposed to be, right? The land of the free and the pursuit of happiness and freedom this and freedom that. And I think one of the things that Black folks, particularly descendants of African slaves, what we have this special relationship to this idea of freedom. It's just so connected to the culture, so connected to how do we overcome, how do we persist, how do we thrive in segregation, how do we thrive with minimal resources, how do we instill, become, and still do brilliant things, and now get to the point 150 years later, right, where I think we're ready to go back to the source of trauma, right, which is the Confederate flag. These are visual terroristic things, but plantations, language, systemic kinds of racism, and negotiate from a position of pride and power and respect. And that's why we're here in this context, opposed to burn it down that, right? So we're approaching this in a way that I think we can learn something and build community around a transformation that needs to happen. So when Diane reached out to me and about what she could do to help, we had a conversation. It was like, maybe we need to do a symposium, right? Maybe we need to get folks talking in deeper kind of ways that can lead to action. That means those students that worked on different parts of this, now is the time for action. It's a call to action. And I think that's one of the things we need to thank the Black Lives Matter movement. But that movement started in the 60s, and that movement started in the 30s. That movement started with Marcus Garvey. That movement, it's a whole train, right, of concatenated movements, little sub movements that build to a bigger movement. And I think this is a part of that. And so I appreciate being here and all these incredible people as we move forward.
Thank you. My question now is to Dr. Jackson. Dr. Jackson, you're an anthropologist. So you study not just people, but some of the icons, some of the symbols. If you had to give us 2 or 3 points, we were rewriting, you had the floor, and we could write anything we wanted to write in terms of reimagining the Gamble Plantation or the Gamble Mansion. 2 or 3 points that you think are important to include were the narrative to be rewritten.
Well, as a cultural anthropologist, again, bringing back, as a cultural anthropologist, bringing back the points that round 2. As a cultural anthropologist, bringing to the forefront that the difference between history and heritage, in the sense that heritage is what we want to bring forward, imagine, and carry forward as our legacy. So this is what we're talking about today. What is the heritage we want to imagine for this space? And one of the things I would say that we want to imagine is to empower the stories and the voices of people who were enslaved on this plantation and centralize them in that discussion. So one of the things I would write in the narrative would be, this place was the home. This place was the place that enslaved Africans lived, worked, and found joy and pain within a system. Again, the difference to think about, the difference between public and private kind of representation of heritage. So in a public space, we need to create public memory. And as a cultural anthropologist, that's what, again, I'm into this. How do we create public memory? We do that by listening to the stories and connecting those stories in the past to the present. And I do think words matter. I think the way we use language matters, because some people aren't maybe as knowledgeable, or just maybe haven't been exposed as much as this panel. So if we say mansion versus plantation in a public memory setting, we kind of negate the fact that this was a system of enslavement. This was a place that by law, people were enslaved. They worked here. They didn't have any freedoms. Some people might have had different experiences, but in the public point, they were enslaved. Segregation was by law. It wasn't by, and so people who had various experiences I'm not a deficit model person either. I've come from, like most people on this panel, probably people who got a full blown empowering ethic from our families. And we were lucky to do that. But I think public spaces are the places where some people, this is the only place that they will get educated. These spaces, institutions like universities and things like that. So the 2 points: listen to the voices and stories of enslaved people, or the people who were the majority population on this plantation site, and incorporate that in the heritage we want to bring forward as an empower, as not empowering in that there wasn't enslavement, but empowering that those folks were fighting for their freedom. They were doing the best they could in all kinds of circumstances. And we need to tell that in a more empowering way, the work they did, the ways they lived, and how we can bring that forward. And secondly, again, challenge these notions of the public narrative, the public memory. I would rewrite that, and that's what we're talking about. How do we rewrite the public memory here at Gamble Plantation and talk about public, systemic, public versus private, and knowing that heritage is active is what we do. We have the power, as we're talking about now, to tell those stories. It's not by happenstance, as you hear from this panel, that these stories are the way they are. And we are right now at a moment to be able to challenge that. So all of us are active. We're active storytellers. And so I would, again, engage people with that kind of sense of duty and sense of power, that we are active, and we should be very conscious of how we speak and how we share that knowledge in the public. But start with the stories of the people directly impacted by what we're talking about.
I want to ask a follow-up question on that, please, that has everything to do with two terms I've heard when we started this conversation today: fear and shame. There were references to fear and shame around the issue of slavery, of being descendants of slaves. Descendants, I should say, of people who were enslaved, not of slave, but people who were enslaved. As we talk about these terms, fear and shame, and moving forward in a broader society and having stories told, can you speak a little bit about how refashioning or telling the other side of the stories empower people, both white people and Black people, to understand fear and shame, or to put it away? I've heard most of the panelists talk about the fact that we, myself included, grew up in families where empowerment was a part of our very being. It did not, however, negate going to school. When I was in non-segregated schools, being called, oh, you're a slave, are you a slave, all of the nastiness that children still today hear. Your comments, please, or your thoughts about how telling stories, telling the other side of stories, and correcting misinformation impacts the fear and shame that floats out there in the universe.
Yeah, one point is that these stories about plantations have been inverted, in the sense that the people who were the technology leaders who did the actual work, they've been cast as people who didn't know what they were doing, who were often given terms of lazy, or being told all the things to do on a plantation. So we need to reverse that. The knowledge leaders, the technology leaders, especially on the rice plantations, were the enslaved Africans. They brought that technology, brought that knowledge. You don't hear that when you visit these sites. You just hear about a lump sum, people labored, people, as a lump group lumped into not knowing what was going on, or being told every aspect of what they had to do, or, being led. So we have to start by reversing that. The more we hear about the ways that Africans labored on these plantations, the skills that they brought, and that was valued, and make those stories, tell those stories in a way that showcase the value that the Africans and people who worked on these plantations brought. So we have to, that's why the stories are important. They showcase the skills, the knowledge, and the sheer humanity of the fact that people who engage in those kinds of subject to that kind of life still manage to marry and sing and raise families and create a space that we are here. So we need to talk about both the humanity and the actual labor. So the shame is that when you go to these spaces, typically you don't see those kinds of stories. You don't hear the stories of the things that Africans actually did in terms of their laboring roles or the artisan roles or all those kinds of things. You don't hear that. And it's not celebrated for white folk or black folk or anybody. They all hear the negatives or the fact again that those folk weren't skilled, they weren't knowledgeable. So we need to reverse those stories.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. So my last question today is going to be for you, Mr. Sims. So where do we go from here? We now have a national conversation raised about the Confederate flag, the very property that we are on now, the Gamble Plantation, is opportunity for us to continue having dialogue about the Confederate flag and Confederate iconology. What happens next?
Um, well, I think we have to confront the institutions to have power and a stranglehold over these spaces. Speaking to this idea of shame, I mean, I don't think shame is necessarily all that bad sometimes. Sometimes you need to reflect in shame to do the right thing, right? I think there needs to be a collective shame and even slight reflective guilt about some of the very terrible things that are deposited in our history so that we can be in constant conversation of what humans can do to each other when they don't pay attention to their higher self. And so, with that in mind, I think it's important to look at these spaces as a possibility and a portal for healing, right? Healing on so many different levels. And so, my hope is that we can, you know, reach out to our legislators, reach out to the governor, or reach out to the state of Florida to make to partner with this new energy, right? To be able to recontextualize and tell the full story and to be able to look at that part of our history in a very direct and a very confident kind of way and build a forthcoming culture that can be liberating and can be connective and not sort of disconnective. And so, with that in mind, like Sandra, she and I talked about her being in on these groups and institutions here at the plantation who are making these decisions. We need to have there's the headquarters for the Florida United Daughters of the Confederacy. We need to have some other headquarters here to reflect the history of descendants of African enslaved folks. So I think there needs to be some real changes and some real physical implementation of those changes, whether there's is monuments brought here, whether there's making markers, whether there's new programming, and how that connects to the school systems, the education systems. And I think we're in this moment when we can make that. So I see that happening across the country, because after we bring down these physical objects, there's still more work to do, right? There needs to be an education process. I think there needs to be maybe a national, sort of agenda about how should we think about slave plantations in general, right? And that brought into a national discussion on a federal level and the relationship to state parks and that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but just being here in this moment is part of the conversation. Now we move into action, and so that we can embody these ideas in monuments and memorials and markers that can help pave the path to more understanding and to a better community, right? More perfect union, or whatever the language we use. whatever the president be saying about, but I think this is a start. And yeah, so I hope I answered that a little
Thank
bit.
you so much, John. I want to thank you all for allowing me to facilitate today. And I know that this is just part one. There is more to come for our audience. Dr. Waldman, would you please tell us what's next in terms of the series that you are engaged in?
Absolutely. I'm sorry, I might take off my mask at this final state here. Yes, thank you all again for this. We don't know if we want to. We have one question. Well, one question from the Q&A, but it actually sort of I can answer. It's sort of directed towards my stuff anyway, so maybe I'll answer this really briefly, and then I'll get to the kind of follow-ups here. Someone had asked, has research been done on the everyday lives of enslaved at Gambles? How much do we know about their activities like gardening, fishing, and hunting? And sort of connected, the second question is commenting on what you might expect to find related to the enslaved at Gamble and what hurdles are there. So I can answer really quickly. Yeah, we have been doing archaeological research here for several years. There was archaeological research done in the 80s and 90s as well, and we have current and potential future work being done at the ruins of the sugar mill that relate to the labor, of course, and the everyday lives of the enslaved people who are working at that mill day in and day out, right? So we're continuing that work going forward. In terms of, and this is something that Chandra sort of brought up, there's a lot of, how do I put this, vague references in the historical record, and there's some ambiguity to where the enslaved laborers were living, where the slave village is actually located. And so we're kind of continuing work forward on that. There is a possibility we know probably where they were located, but it's on it's not part of the state park currently. The state park is only a certain amount of acreage, so unfortunately these areas have yet to be investigated, and hopefully they can be preserved in some way if they haven't been gone through development yet, and we can continue to look for them and work with descendants and historians and archivists and community members towards finding these locations. So it's something we're continuing to work on. But I also want to point to, and this is one more thing, if we look at the landscape here of this plantation, right, you look at the mansion, that was the everyday lives of the enslaved people who constructed this beautiful mansion, right, that made the tabby, that constructed this place. It was the enslaved people who cooked in a kitchen in the back and probably slept there as well, and in this back part of the mansion, who that was their everyday lives, right? So this space, the canals that were dug, the mill that was built, this space, this landscape represents those everyday lives, and the resilience and everything that Dr. Jackson spoke of, and Chandra and John, those, the joy, the pain, all of these things, that this plantation represents that. And I think that's why we're all here today, is to ensure that is not continually silenced or forgotten moving forward. So thank you all for being here. And in continuing conversation, we have several other events coming up in this series here. And the next one will be on Wednesday at 7 p.m. It'll also be on Zoom. You can find it on our Facebook page, the registration link, and that is consists of academics, historians, and archaeologists who are working on these issues and how focusing on how academics can contribute to these conversations going forward. And the final and keynote symposium will be on Saturday, February 6th. And that will be John Sims performing out of the Ringling Museum, the Oslo Theater. And that will be virtually presented as well on Zoom and our Facebook, and you can find the registration links there as well. And we hope that this will just build, and we want to continue to have these conversations, build a consortium, a collective of people who are interested in having these discussions from a diversity of perspectives. So I want to thank you again. Thank you, Renee, for your wonderful moderation today, and thank the panel and everybody watching. One more, John.
Yeah, and folks could find their way to the petition at change.org. Just look up John Sims projects. You can have access to that. Appreciate you reaching out for that.